last public business meeting.
The last public business meeting was held on the 10th of October with David McConnell in the chair. McConnell was the auditor of the push against allowing women into the Hist, so out of the goodness of my heart, I spent the whole of the inaugural loudly fidgeting with my jewellery and blowing kisses to the audience so he could go home and say that he'd done the right thing all those years ago. This week, I normally at this point make jokes about the motion, but if you Google ISIS jokes, you're in for a world of pain. So instead, I'm going to tell a story about someone who isn't here. That person is former debates convener Stephen James Barr. Oh, he is here. Wonderful. And this is a story about a time Stephen was judging the European Debating Championships in Krakow. And the final was an open vodka bar, and he walked to this open vodka bar with a bottle of Smirnoff in one hand and Belvedere vodka in the other, drinking the two, goes to an open vodka bar. As the story has been told to me, there are some gaps in the story. The next thing he knows, he's talking about monetary policy to a Cambridge debater. Then he's being wheeled out in a wheelchair by the paramedics. Then he's waking up in a Polish drunk tank covered in someone else's blood. Then the auditor gets a call being like, one of the people off your committee is in a Polish drunk tank covered in someone else's blood. Incidentally, Polish drunk tanks are currently under investigation by the European Court of Human Rights for human rights abuses. Gets a call being like, you have to come bail him out. She shows up to the jail. He isn't there. So in Dublin, we're getting all these messages being like, Stephen's missing. He's somewhere in Krakow. He's possibly still drunk. Find Stephen. He's trending on Twitter. Panic is rising and rising and rising. Eventually he shows up at the hotel like half a day later. Again, someone else's blood, everything torn. Thousand miles stare in his eyes. And with that, the meeting teacher.
So, prevent me my moment's confusion there. I thought I was listening to a story about the latest episode of the UKIP Party Club. After recovering my equilibrium. So, are there any objections to my signing these minutes as a true and accurate account of the last public business meeting? I was expecting a little bit of drama. Our own UKIP episode there. Okay, then I shall duly sign. Right, okay, well, consider them signed. Now I'd like to call upon the auditor to introduce the invited guests to the house.
So our chair for tonight is Declan Power. Declan is a former Irish Army soldier, defence analyst and author. His later years of service in the Army were spent attached to the Chief of Staff's branch of Defence Force headquarters. He's a graduate of Dublin City University and Trinity College Dublin, and as of 2013 he was a contributing analyst in security and defence management at a variety of institutions and media. I'm not sure why that's as of 2013 and not 2016, but I'm sure you still do a lot of stuff. Our proposition guest is Sheikh based in Ireland. He is the chair of the Irish Muslim Peace and Integration Council, a national representative of the Muslim body with a presence in Dublin, Cork, Athlone, Croatia and Belfast. Our opposition guest is Dr. Mariam Benrad, a political scientist. She's a specialist in the Arab world. She's a member of the French Political Science Association and the Middle East Studies Association. After having been an associate professor at American, she notably directs studies in peace and development. Just a few standing orders though, if you all look at your arbitrary returns with the point on your seat. First of all, I'd like to ask all of you to please fill those out. There's guidelines on the side for how we should fill them out. We use these at the end of the year to give prizes out for best speakers, so it is really important for those people, so you can tell them if they're really bad or if they're really good. You get to decide. The first thing I would just note is that Annabelle O'Rourke is unfortunately pulled out, and in her place, Meg there is going to be speaking. Did I pronounce your name?
No.
No. Well, you just.
Exactly.
Meg is all you need to know. Write that during the middle 5 minutes, anyone, all of you guys get to stand up and offer them a question if you'd like. So say something along the lines of point of information or on that point, and the speaker can choose to accept or reject you. If they accept you, then please keep your question to about 15 seconds or less, and if they reject you, then please just sit down and don't offer another point for about 15 or 20 seconds. Yeah, other than that though, I don't think there's anything, so I'll hand you back over to the chair to start the debate.
Okay, so for such a momentous moment, I thought I'd stand. The question before the House this evening is, this House believes that Western intervention has strengthened ISIS. And I should now like to call upon Meg Beer to propose the motion to the House.
Okay, when I agreed to step in for Annabelle at the last minute, I thought that no one would know anything about ISIS, so it'd be fine, and then it turns out we have guests who actually know what they're talking about. So this bodes very poorly for me. So I'm going to ask you to cross out Meg and put Annabelle back in, just for the end of the year. Okay, so this debate, like all debates, is not really about current affairs, it's about patterns, it's about principles, and it's about history. Western intervention in the Middle East, in Iraq and Syria, did not start with drones and airstrikes. It did not start with the rise of ISIS in 2016. Western intervention in the Middle East in general has led to ISIS being as strong as it is now. Okay, it's not just what's happened since the US coalition has started. Okay, when the British took control of the area after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, they used the same strategy that worked for them everywhere else, which was putting locals in charge so that they didn't have to use as many of their resources as possible. They didn't have to use as many resources, they could just rely on local rulers. And what they did in Iraq was they used predominantly, they predominantly put Sunnis in charge, even though it was not a predominantly Sunni area, okay? This created a scenario where you had like a greater level of political involvement among one group of people that was disproportionate to their actual the actual demographics of the area. Something that would like stoke the fires when you have this kind of historical like tradition and entitlement, stoke the fires of ISIS like 100 years later, when suddenly different groups of people find themselves not quite cut out, but no longer having the same influence that they once had, okay? Western intervention set power dynamics, strengthened ISIS. That is Western intervention strengthening ISIS, okay? And so where did ISIS grow from, okay? ISIS was originally Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They were like trained and armed by, okay? So all the training that ISIS have, their top command, all that knowledge is originally coming from the Americans and the British. That's where all that is coming from. The strength of ISIS tactics, the strength of ISIS training, the people that taught them how to shoot, how to fight, all that comes from the Americans and the British, okay? That is, again, Western intervention in the Middle East that has caused ISIS to be as strong as it is now, okay? Al-Baghdadi was the third in command in Al-Qaeda in Iraq. This is a Western intervention creating creating the ISIS that we have today. It might not have been the only force, but by God, it like calcium in the bones of ISIS, okay? And when the Americans pulled out of Iraq, I know that the Iraq War is a whole other, like, I don't know, basket of vipers, can of worms. When the Americans pulled out, are you objecting to me calling the Iraq War a basket of vipers? I'm not going to take you then. So when al-Maliki was left in charge, and again, he had been working with the Americans for years. He's part, he is part of the American involvement in Iraq. One of the things he did was he got rid of he got rid of a lot of Sunni commanders from his army, who then, like, obviously were more than a little pissed off at losing their position, again, as a result of this, and they went and they joined al-Baghdadi. So part of this destabilizing, part of the power structures that are put in place as a result of, no, there's no one up there, I don't know why Ronan's looking up there. Probably to avoid looking at my ugly face. Exactly. So again, this is another thing where Western intervention created the strong ISIS that we had today. No one's trying to say that it's the only factor. No one's trying to say that there aren't like valuable arguments for like military intervention, although I'm personally quite opposed to it. No, Jack, you're in favour of nuclear weapons. But we cannot talk about ISIS unless we talk about British colonialism. We cannot talk about ISIS unless we talk about Cold War, unless we talk about the legacy of the Iraq War. So kind of with some historical there, regardless of whether or not a Western-led coalition could eventually defeat ISIS, possible that the Western intervention is like a recruitment strategy for them. It does make them stronger. It allows them to recruit in places like Saudi Arabia. It allows them to recruit among disenfranchised people of Middle Eastern descent in the West who feel neither part of their parents' culture or the culture of the country that they've lived in. The way that Western powers are, the way that Western militaries are acting in the Middle East is actively a recruitment tool. Also, something that I forgot to mention was that, like the British and the Americans took a bunch of arms from Libya and brought it and gave it to other rebel groups in Iraq and Syria. Now, apart from all the immense deal of confusion as to can you actually, there's over 1,000 different rebel groups. How can you actually like sort out like the moderates from the extremists? No, Jack in a box. Honestly, up and down. The fact that it's your name makes it even more funny. So now I've lost my train of thought. Perfect. The fact that, so beyond the complexity of working out who to actually give these guns to, like also there's been like several cases of like when ISIS capture these rebel groups, they take all the guns that were put there by the Americans and the British, okay? It as a policy, it's failed catastrophically in that we keep on giving guns to people that we think should have them, but in the end they end up in the hands of ISIS. So apart from training them on how to use the weapons in the first place, we end up through like, in the end of it, actively giving guns to them, which makes obviously then when we go in and... How's it going?
There is somebody.
I know, honestly, it's actually more comforting knowing that there's someone watching me from behind as opposed to just suspecting it. Basically, like, Western intervention, bad. Peace, good. Please propose.
Could we now have Paul Malloy, please, to
Right, so Mr. Chair, Mr. Auditor, ladies and gentlemen of the College Historical Society. So Meg started us off tonight with a speech about Iraq. Now, I don't want to be in any way complacent about this because I do recognise that Iraq was by every means a mess. But I think it's kind of losing sight of what we really need to talk about, because when we're talking about Iraq, we should remember that while ISIS did start there, ISIS were beaten back during the surge. ISIS was nearly basically defeated. We nearly knocked them into effectively non-existence. So then Iraq went to Syria. They went to Syria because there was no intervention, there was nobody there to stop them, to beat them back again, so they became strong. She also talked about, the origins of Al-Qaeda, which is kind of odd given the fact that was 1979. I don't know how many years before ISIS was founded. But, if you want to blame that on America, you might as well also blame it on the Soviets. And you can keep going back in history as far as you want when it comes to the mess that we've made there. And it's true that we did make a mess there. But the question we have to ask is considering the mistakes we made in the past, what are we going to do about them? What are we going to do to stop this mess? What are we going to do like, I know, my mother always told me if you make a mess, you own it, right? So, like, we have an onus ourselves to stop this conflict. Yes, Meg?
This debate is disbelieved Western intervention has strengthened ISIS, not Western intervention.
Well, so, like,
would strengthen
yeah, no, I get
ISIS.
that, I get
So
that.
we have
But the
to
fact,
move
no,
forward.
it is. But, like, we bet them back, we made them weak. We pulled out, we stopped intervening, they became strong. I don't understand, like, why that isn't relevant. Like, as far as I'm concerned, the debate really should be this House believes Western intervention would weaken ISIS, but that's not really my decision to make. But anyway, yeah, so my speech. ISIS. So what are they? Well, they're, by any, I mean ISIS is a name firstly to start with rather than an acronym. You know, it's an organization that makes hundreds of millions of dollars each year, which exerts its influence through a large geographic area and is intent on controlling more. It follows an extremist system of belief which it forces on individuals as well as against them, actually threatening its own people as well as the peoples of the world. I do not have to list the various crimes ISIS has committed, other than to say that, you know, as I've said, they were not caused by Western intervention, but rather by a lack of it. So, if we consider ISIS, we see an organization which rose to prominence, filling a power vacuum in the Middle East. Its main cause, you know, it was created by a stasis in a conflict that was continued through Russian intervention again, going back to Afghanistan, I suppose, supporting Assad. And we believe that Western appeasement of Russia has created that, as well as, you know, resulted in other human rights abuses because we refuse to stand up to them. And the second cause I would probably argue leading to ISIS is the funding they receive from radical organizations, as well as the promotion of radical and, you know, fundamentalist ideologies around the world. So, you know, in some cases they're not done just by organizations, but by individuals who are high-ranking members of certain governments. Yeah, it is also caused by our decision not to make a decision in the first place. You know, when we decided by choosing to draw the finish line for Assad to ensure that there was continued loss of life, when we decided by believing the immorality of markets, by trading arms with dictators, and by buying oil sold to support authoritarian regimes, we washed our hands of the Middle East. We decided by looking away beyond our borders and building walls between us and them, that we've also been complacent in the rise of ISIS and its dominance over millions of people. So, yeah, you know, we believe effectively that we need humanitarian intervention here, but we believe that we need military intervention to support that, to secure it. And why is military intervention good? Well, I suppose military intervention is good because if we look at Kosovo or East Timor and many other places, we see the justification for it when we consider, you know, such a cause. You know, if we look to Rwanda, if we look to the Congo and many places where we have left conflict to stir, we see what is the result of our complacency. So we think that we should intervene then to ensure that this doesn't continue. Yeah, so we also have seen that in this region diplomacy doesn't work. So when we look at, for example, the negotiations with Assad, you know, we tried to negotiate to get chemical weapons out of there. We see that he's continuing to use them, in this case chlorine gas. We see that ISIS is using them as well. So, like, I don't know, I always find it kind of, I don't want to use the word funny because that's really too flippant, but I consider it quite peculiar. So, like, what I always think of is, so, like, ISIS is using mustard gas in this region, and, you know, I can't understand why people are taking, like, a pacifist policy, like, when it comes to this, because I always think of that line from Wilfred Owen, you know, vile incurable sores on innocent tongues. Like, ISIS is using this gas, which caused that in the first place, on, like, 1-year-old children, for example, in the town of Maria, in one of those attacks. And, like, they're even refusing to let humanitarian intervention take place. So, you know, we think we should intervene militarily to support that. And such, you know, intervention can take a variety of forms other than military intervention as well. So, like, if we consider that 3,500 fighters for ISIS are Western, it is clear that, you know, there's much we need to do here. We need to, like, for example, end ghettoization in our cities. We need to crack down on, you know, radicalization in all of our beliefs, you know, and find a solution to the migrant crisis rather than, you know, demonizing refugees and immigrants. You know, so we must say no to all corners of our political system that seek to undermine our social and legal rights, you know, the rights that undermine our civil authority. You know, we need to also attack their finances. We need to, you know, whether that be drug smuggling, whether it be oil sales, or, you know, funding from foreign sources, from organizations, from individuals, or from governments as well. We need to, you know, Those are rights we should seek to promote across the globe, those social and legal rights. But ultimately, military intervention will be necessary to end these abuses, to effectively stop the suffering. So, what we, or at the very least I, would propose as a proper solution would be, that the mistakes that we've made in Iraq would to ask yourself, would you consider it not just for a year or for two, in some cases in this house, since second year in college, your second year in college, like ladies and gentlemen, wondering what has happened to your brother or your sister, your niece or nephew, them wondering as well what happened to their parents, are they ever going to see them again? What we are calling for is considered planning, carefully conducted and implemented to stabilise and pacify the region. So, ladies and gentlemen, I beg you to oppose.
I shall waive those. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to put forward the motion that this House believe Western intervention has strengthened ISIS. First, I'd like to have a few rebuttals. However, I left a space here to put in rebuttals. However, I actually agree with a lot of what Paul said, because he said a lot of what the West has done, which is what we are debating. So I will be mostly reiterating his points here. I would like to take the opportunity to talk about what Western intervention means to the people of Syria and Iraq. Now, the West, and in particular the US, have always professed their love for freedom, peace, and democracy. Ever since the US debuted on the world stage with their big awesome wars in the 1900s, they've always justified their wars by claiming they are for democracy and the greater good. They've always believed, or at least tried to look like they believe, that what they are doing is the right thing to do. This reasoning is, of course, justification that the Western coalition, which is led by the US, have been using while they use their jets to bomb Syrian towns and kill those big bag terrorists. Now, when we think about how the Syrian and Iraqi people see this, of course, we would assume that they would see it as our hero, the West, coming to save us in our time of need, again. However, I don't think this is how they see these airstrikes. I believe that when they see their towns and villages being blown to pieces, they see it as the West doing what the West always does, looking after its own interests. Because the kind of terror and bloodshed that the West now claims it is trying to stop has been going on for years, while the Assad regime has been killing civilians, bombing hospitals, and allegedly using chemical weapons. What did the West do then? It gave Assad a stern warning, told him that's not very nice, and hoped he would stop. Now, ask yourself, why was the West happy to sit back and watch this violence, but suddenly gets up in arms when it comes to ISIS? Simply put, it comes down to the people that are being killed. As far as the West is concerned, as long as it is the Middle East that is killing itself, they don't care. But when a group emerges that threatens the West directly, it has to be swatted down. This is why, yes.
Do you not think ISIS rose because of the lack of Western intervention in the first place? To make this strong.
I'm getting to that later, why I think Western intervention, why people joined it due to Western intervention. This is why Western intervention is fundamentally wrong way to fight ISIS. It reinforces the idea that many ISIS recruits have, that the West only cares about the Middle East when it causes it a discomfort. What interested me while I was researching this today was the reason people join ISIS. In our minds, we see them all as barbarians, as people who are the worst thing since the Nazis. But one question is, why so many people, and we have to keep in mind that a lot of these people, before ISIS came about, were normal people. They didn't have these extremist views. This is why they joined this organization. One of the main reasons I read online from former or captured members of ISIS was that they wished to help their Sunni brethren in Syria, who they felt were being oppressed by Assad, who comes from a different branch of Islam. They were no doubt frustrated with the West's lack of support for the rebels and decided to join ISIS. Yes.
Can you tell us which rebel group in Syria that the West should have supported?
No. taking some time to try and find one. I mean, they're supporting them right now. They're training the Kurds. They're training different groups. So they are supporting some. They're just not giving them adequate support, is what I would say to that. The discontent with the West can only be worsened now by the coalition forces have decided to strike against ISIS, who many Sunni Muslims in the area feel are protecting them, while not striking against the which many feel are targeting Sunnis. If the West really cared about defeating ISIS for the good of Syria and the Iraqi people, they would also be forming a coalition against the Assad regime as well. Then all of Syria could unite against ISIS, rather than a sort of only serve to weaken those who stand against ISIS. Instead, yes.
How can we have a proper mobilization against Assad if he's being backed by the international power of Russia without any countervailing international support from the West?
I have an alternative, which is my point is that instead the US provides the Free Syrian Army with financial and military training. This kind of support is only enough to keep them afloat, and if anything, perpetuates the conflict. Personally, I would rather have had Assad win the war and have a stable government to face ISIS, rather than this kind of violence, which just continues to murder innocent civilians and sends more and more migrants on their way to die on the way to Europe. Sorry, I lost my point. Yes.
Okay, so if this analysis holds true for Syria, maybe. So how do you think this interacts with Iraq, where Western intervention in Iraq has literally put ISIS on its last legs within Iraq?
I don't have this written down, but I did research this point, that when the US invaded Iraq, which was a terrible idea to do, and they completely took apart their army, put it back together, and what was the first thing that happened when ISIS ran into Iraq? Iraq's armies retreated. They couldn't fight it. Now, after a few months, they've managed to make a bit of a comeback, but if they had a strong force there to begin with, maybe this wouldn't still be going on. The US seems content to throw fuel on the fire, but not do anything to resolve the matter. In summation, the idea of Western intervention isn't a terrible idea. When people and nations work together towards a common goal, it can only bring them closer together. However, when the West selectively decides what problems it wants to help, all it does is alienate the local populace and them any alternative. For some of those desperate people in Iraq and Syria, ISIS is unfortunately that alternative. This is why I strongly support this motion. Thank you.
Could we have Richard Wolf now to oppose?
Richard, everybody, I believe you're a maiden as well.
Yes, indeed.
Well, then you're entitled to maiden's rights as well, so I'm feeling available now, but if you choose to accept them, then no one can ask you a question. If you choose to reject them, then we'll give you a big round of applause. Which would you like?
Well, it's a lovely audience, so give me an applause. All right, let's start. In the past debates, there have been some people who had like really hot seats, so they can engage now, right? So please stand up. Honorable jury, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor. I'm just an Erasmus student, so I've just been here for a few weeks actually, so I'm very excited. And I think I made a good choice signing up for this debate. So we already had a photo op, we had some good wine upstairs, so some comfy seats, and I didn't have to queue for this seat. It's the best seat, I'm sure. So yeah, everybody should also join, I guess. But this is a serious debate, so let's get started. We from the opposition bench believe that the Western intervention has not strengthened ISIS. And I will refer to ISIS not as ISIS or ISIL, but maybe more appropriately Daesh, because that's what they don't like. So let's keep that. And so just looking at the powder keg that is the Levant, which is where ISIS is currently occupying the region. So we talk about Iraq and Syria. It is actually no wonder that the region is struggling. Every nation and region has troubles, like Ireland had also had some troubles in the past. But if we look at this particular region, it is actually no doubt that it's struggling so heavily right now. And I believe there's two reasons. So one reason, which is quite obvious to everyone who follows the media, is, well, Islamic fundamentalism. We see there's a rift between the Shia and the Shiite Muslims. So this is one reason. And the second reason that there is this struggle right now is sectarianism. So we have, for example, the Kurds, and we have the Alawites. We have all sorts of different ethnic groups within the region who disagree on so many points with one another. So it is actually no doubt that this is the main factor for what we see right now and for what we experience right now in Syria and Iraq. So if we have just a quick look back at the recent past, so think back like 2012, there was actually a crucial turning point to be for the Syrian civil war. We had the president of Syria, who's still unfortunately in charge, Bashar Assad, and he started using chemical weapons against his own populace. So this is outlawed by so many different types of international agreements, most commonly known also the Chemical Weapons Convention, and basically every nation on this planet signed up to this. But nobody actually did something, but then we had Barack Obama who said, yes, let's put a red line on it. And well, unfortunately no one was actually willing to join in. And I think that was a mistake. The Western powers should have done more to support his initiative. Not even Great Britain, actually. Like, it was kind of an embarrassment because they usually support USA, don't they? And so we believe that this was a mistake, and well, this has tainted his record ever since. So we will see this, well, his work remains undone. And so hundreds of thousands of people have died by now. So this is a huge tragedy, and it shouldn't have happened. We've had not migrants. We have had so many different refugees all over Europe, but of course also in the neighboring regions of the conflict regions. And if we had done more, if we had just established maybe a safe zone, as we could still in northern Syria, just as a backdoor for humanitarian measures, and maybe a no-fly zone, so maybe intervention light, if you so will, this would all not have happened. So that's why we think the Western powers should do more. Actually, I agree with this. The previous speaker said, yes, the Western powers, they should do more, but how can we do more if not starting with humanitarian measures and with doing and with starting an intervention, also militarily if need be. So maybe we can get a fragile peace in this region, yes, maybe, but it's better than what we currently face, right, isn't it? Because we see destruction on every single level. And if we had done something better, if we had done more in the past, yes, we have made some mistakes, I agree with that. The West has done so many horrible things, surely. But in this case, we should have done more. This is the worst of all outcomes. So it's very simple, actually, in this debate. In order for our side to persuade you, we don't even need to show you that we need the intervention. We only need to show you that the West has not strengthened ISIS, right? I think that's really simple, because what I mentioned in the beginning was there's two reasons. We have the fundamentalists. We have, of course, always had the Islam in that region for several centuries, and there will always be some people who are more extremists. There have been times where this was tolerated, where it was okay, but nowadays we see that it has come to more and more extremes. So the big reason for concern is that we have a major shift now in Islam. And I believe that we can see this also just by the word of terrorism. What do we think of? You hear terrorism? Terrorism? Yeah, Islamic terrorism, isn't it? So I believe that the majority of the casualties and the very majority of physical and psychological damage that the people have suffered actually is not affecting the West so much, is it? We don't have the hundreds of thousands of people dying over the last few years. No, it's only happened within the Muslim communities. So we see actually the Western powers are not affected by this, but we have an objective to do something, to make the world a better place. We can do something. So why don't we intervene? Yes, this is a really difficult mission, But if we don't do anything, the world will see how this conflict goes on and on. And so let's come to my last point. So I know we have maybe lackluster enthusiasm right now for intervention. That may be the case. But if we don't do anything, we will see Putin take over the region, or Erdogan for that matter. It's also not so pleasant, I believe. We see that Palmyra, the ruins of this city, of this great city. We see the people in Mosul, we see the people in Aleppo who are currently striving for their very lives. And if we, the West, don't do anything in this case, then I don't really know what we stand for right now. So with that, I proudly oppose. Thank you. Let's do something.
Thank you, Richard. Now I'd like to ask Sheikh Dr. Umar Al-Qadri.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, most compassionate, ever merciful. Ladies and gentlemen, I greet you with the Islamic greeting of peace. If you know the reply, please reply loudly. Assalamu alaikum. You've all converted to Islam. Well done. Well, I'm an imam. I'm a sheikh and imam. And one of the jobs and responsibilities that I have is to not convert people to Islam, but at least, create awareness about Islam. When I received an email a few weeks ago with the invitation to speak at this debate, honestly, I could hardly believe that there was a need to debate this motion. I mean, who doesn't know that prior to the so-called war against terror by the West, Daesh did not exist on the surface of this planet, of this earth. There was no such thing as Daesh or ISIS, as some call them. I personally prefer, by the way, the word Daesh, because Daesh really expresses their evil characteristic and attribute. Daesh means those that trample, those that crush not only every single moral authority, every single basic fundamental principle of human rights, but also trample and crush upon the teachings of the Prophet of Islam, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So therefore, I personally prefer to refer to them as Daesh. I also believe that, referring to them as ISIS is recognizing their false claim of... So while I still had my phone in my hands, reading the email, I was thinking about the evil of Daesh, the atrocities that it has been committing in the past few years. And most of its victims have been Muslims, since the Muslim world rejects unanimously their false caliphate. The world's most prestigious Islamic seat of learning in Cairo, the Al-Azhar University, had issued a verdict, a fatwa, among other scholars also, against this false claim of the caliphate by Daesh. I was thinking how Daesh is indiscriminate in their atrocities, in their attacks. In fact, I also was thinking how on the 22nd of March this year, I could have been a victim of their atrocity in Brussels airport, because I was actually flying at the same time to the airport from Dublin when the attack took place. While I was thinking about all of that, suddenly I received a notification. Breaking news. It was a notification that had something to do with the US presidential candidate, Donald Trump. It was that moment, ladies and gentlemen, I realized, yes, there is a need to have this debate. Donald Trump reminded me of someone who absolutely rejects the history, absolutely has no recognition of what has happened in the past. And he comes up with his own theories and ideas. If you ask me, I would go further than the motion. The motion says Western intervention has strengthened Daesh. I would say Western intervention has not only given rise to Daesh, but also to Taliban, to Al-Qaeda, and all form of extremism that we find in the Middle East. Ladies and gentlemen, Islam is a religion that has a 1400 years old history. I mean, Muslims have been living together with other communities, with Jews, Christians, Yazidis, Hindus, Buddhists, all in peace. There had been peaceful coexistence. And the fact that we find Coptic Christians in Egypt, we find Jews in Iraq, is all testimony to the fact that under Muslim rulership for thousands of years, these communities have survived. Despite the disagreements, they have survived. So Islam is not the problem. It isn't Islam. It isn't extremism that has anything to do with the religion itself. But you know, when you think about it, it was only once the West realized there are resources, especially oil, that is found in that region, that the West intervened in one way or another, that we see the rise of such extremism. Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and now in the form of Daesh. So I would argue that Western intervention in the region has not only strengthened Daesh, but also increased this type of extremism. The previous speaker was referring to the Sunni-Shia conflict. 30 years ago, before the Gulf War, in Iraq, Sunnis and Shias had been living together. In fact, they used to go to each other's processions. I, as a Sunni Muslim scholar in this country, until today, visit the Shia mosque. They invite me as a keynote speaker. We have very good relations. I know of people that have married each other among each other, Sunnis and Shias. And 30 years ago, the situation was very peaceful among these communities. This phenomenon of Sunni-Shia conflict, let me tell you, as someone who knows my subject, who knows Islamic sciences, it is a phenomenon that is only 30, 35 years old maximum. And it only started once the West intervened in the Middle East. We find it now also happening, unfortunately, in Pakistan. And again, it's because one of the West's greatest ally, that is known as Saudi Arabia. So, ladies and gentlemen, of course, you know, I mean, there is this point that Western intervention has increased and strengthened Daesh. Not only that, extremism, we all know that. I mean, we can't deny that. Some of the speakers are speaking about the fact that we need to intervene now. We need to do something now. It's our responsibility. We have to look after the world. We have to look after all these people. It is you that have caused this. I mean, it is us. I mean, when I say you, I am part of the West as well. By the way, even though I don't look as your stereotypical Western person, I was born and bred in the Netherlands, so I'm Western as well. But we have caused this problem. And the last thing to do is to think about military intervention, because every time we intervene in the Middle East, whether this is Libya, whether it is Iraq, whether it is Afghanistan, or whether it is Syria, what do we leave after? We all know that. No, thank you very much. Sorry, thank you very much. Sorry. we'll take it later maybe. So in my opinion, I don't think we should intervene at all. When I talk about intervention, it's military intervention, because I believe military intervention, and it is being done right now by the Obama administration, it is being done in indirect sources. Those rebels are being supported that are against Assad. I mean, Assad is obviously not an angel, we don't support him. But to be honest with you, under Bashar's rule, before these rebels, there was peace in Syria. All these people were living together. Christians were living together with Muslims. There was peace. And they used to visit each other's places of worship, which is now unthinkable. So I think even under Bashar al-Assad, they were much better. So this support of these rebels that we see since 2012, through Saudi Arabia, through proxies Saudi Arabia, through Qatar, through the United Arab Emirates, has actually increased extremism, has actually increased, because most of these groups, many academics have written about it, most of these groups, what happens is later on they actually become part of Daesh. And this great idea, that they have, and this is one of the ways that they recruit people. Once they see any Western country or any Western army soldier there, what Daesh is basically saying and is that this is a war between Islam and between the West. And when we as West will intervene there, we will be seen as someone who are there to oppose Islam. And you will not do yourself and ourselves and the world a favor, because these people, the Syrians, don't want us to intervene. They don't want our intervention. They want our humanitarian aid, that's fine, but no military intervention, because they strongly believe, and they have seen it in other countries, as I said. And not only that, in fact, the last two former Secretary Generals of the NATO have said the following. They say that rather than secure humanitarian space and empower a political transition, Western military engagement in Syria is likely to provoke further escalation on all sides, deepening the civil war and strengthening the forces of extremism, sectarianism, and criminality gaining strength across the country. The idea that the West can empower and remotely control moderate forces is optimistic at best. Escalation begets escalation, and mission creeps is a predictable outcome if the West sets out on a military path. I would argue, ladies and gentlemen, that the Western intervention against Daesh is counterproductive and may only strengthen and unite the militant ideology, and has in the past only increased them. So therefore, I would request you to vote in favor of this motion. Thank you very much.
Now we have Dr. Miriam Zenrad, who is opposing.
So good evening. Thank you for your invitation. So I'll be on the opposition side, and since a lot of elements were brought to the debate, I will try to be a bit original. I think actually listening to you, and very early on there was a divergence between the descriptive dimension of your discussion tonight. Has Western intervention strengthened the Islamic State? I call it by its name, and I'll tell you why. I followed the whole discussion as well on naming or not naming. We've had this in France in particular, but I think it's quite important to name it as it is. And the divergence emerged quite early tonight between the descriptive dimensions, what happened before, or what is happening in terms of objective strengthening of the group, and what should be done. And I do not believe, you objected, but I do not believe on my side that the two descriptive and more normative dimensions can be dissociated in this debate. Because based on the assessment you make of the impact of Western intervention, military intervention on the Islamic State strategy and evolution transformations, that has huge consequences for the policy making, for the decision that you will make in terms of pursuing this intervention or using other methods. So, first of all, I would like to question the very notion of the West, because why is naming the Islamic State as such important? It's precisely for what you said. They are in a very binary worldview, which basically very caricaturally oppose on the one hand the Orient or Islam as a sort of very blurred entity. We do not really know what we are talking about, like the Muslim world, Islam, what does it correspond to when we know the very diversity of the region and the fact that we just can't have this perception? It's very Orientalist, actually. And on the other hand, you have the West, the evil West, always attacking the peoples of the region, having by nature evil means, evil objectives. And you have reasons to think so. If you go back, we talked about colonialism, the wounds of colonialism, the very complexity of post-colonial societies, and we are concerned in Europe, starting with the British or the French, who were governing colonial empires, as you know, so this is why we have been so affected, and this is why we have had actually so many jihadists, I believe, because all of this has to do with the deeper history. But I still think that all of this ignores the complexity of what we are talking about. So now, let's come to the question of military intervention. If we're talking about 2003 and military intervention, I would like to say one thing about the US. The US had no plan, actually, on staying. And the plan, the original plan, was to handle the situation by transferring very quickly the power to interim authorities to the Iraqis. As you know, in the very first weeks of the war, the insurgency started. Paul Bremer, at the time, who was heading the CPA, the Coalition Provisional Authority, made quite a few mistakes that actually forced the US to stay and manage the situation. So you can assess this period and say that the West made a lot of mistakes. Of course, the tortures, the abuse, the way some Iraqis were dealt with. But at the same time, let's not strip or let's not ignore the responsibility of the actors on the ground themselves. Because all of this is much more complicated. It is not only on the one hand a Western army torturing, abusing people, and on the other hand, for instance, insurgent groups or political actors not abusing their own people or bearing a share of responsibility. I'll give you one example. The insurgent groups, okay, they would portray themselves as, freedom fighters, but speaking about the Islamic State, we saw to what extent the so-called freedom fighter becomes actually the colonizer or the one abusing his own people. On the other hand, let's remember that at the time the Islamic State of Iraq first appeared, the ones who went to the American army, to the generals, saying, we need your assistance for dealing with this threat, the jihadist threat, which is threatening our social environment, our people, our villages, we need you to help us. And this worked quite well, because if you ask, has Western intervention strengthened ISIS, they are in limbos now, just like, where they were in 2008 when the cooperation between the US Army and a number of tribes on the ground and volunteers helped get rid of this organization, which once again was abusive towards the people it claimed to represent. So I really dissociate the local landscape, the people, the Iraqis, from the jihadists who have a very different agenda. If we're talking about today, they have lost almost all their territory in Iraq. Mosul is on the verge of collapsing. And if you ask the people in the liberated territories, do you want these people to be back? Do you want ISIS to be back? They will tell you no. And let's remember also that in 2014, the Iraqis themselves, including the ones who are opposing American occupation, said, you have to come back and help us now. And you have a moral obligation towards us. You cannot just let all these people come, conquer our territories, tear our communities, and go away. So this is the moral debate. But I would also add, what do we call ISIS? It's become a Western problem. We have so many Western jihadists. It's a global phenomenon. They have a very specific agenda, which is a very destructive one. There is no room for negotiation. They do not want to negotiate. They are convinced that there is an existential war between the West and Islam. As you know, they have this very apocalyptic view of the struggle, which is not only threatening to Iraq and Syria, but also to our societies. And we have seen the consequences with, of course, the attacks on our soil, including in France, which is my country, as you can hear it with my accent, of course. So I do think that we need to go beyond the usual binary West versus Orient or West versus Islam thing, and to take into consideration the complexity of what is going on the ground. And it's just, I think it's a matter of not only reconstructing or allowing local communities to have a future, and they ask for our help, most of them, but it has also to do with our own future. Are we going to let the Middle East rot and just close our eyes and think that we're going to live in peace? Especially in Europe, we're just next door, as I need to remember you. Mosul will engender flows of displaced and refugees. So we are directly concerned, and it's too easy to say that we are the evil ones and that we should just withdraw and let, once again, the Middle East or the broader Muslim world rot on its side, while it doesn't correspond to the requests expressed by a lot of its people. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Benrad. Now we have Ivani Karmakar to propose.
Right, so this house believes Western intervention has strengthened ISIS. I'm not trying to convince you about this. Yes, we're saying, yeah, ISIS have lost territory, but as we've heard all through this debate, because of the neocolonial attitudes, is what have got us here. It's what's created hostility in like the Middle East, arguably in any region that's been separated along religious borders for the benefit of colonial powers. Like that's what's been creating this hostility for decades and decades and centuries, and like almost inevitably, that's what's reached like its culmination in Daesh, as it has in many other things through many other periods in our history. I'm not trying to convince you that, you know, ISIS or Daesh is bad. It is. You know it is. And I'm not trying to make this an IR debate because, frankly, I don't know all that much about IR. I'm a medic, and I'm interested in global healthcare policy. And, like, at the end of the day, that's what my speech is going to come down to, because I think that, yeah, we hear a lot about, you know, how, yeah, Western intervention should, like, help in a humanitarian way. But until the point that, you know, we stop giving aid just to ingrain ourselves into the hearts of the people we're going to kill, and until the point that, you know, we keep on bombing areas we have hurt again and again, like the Kunduz hospital bombing in Afghanistan in 2015, until we stop bombing our front lines with ISIS, you know, where they have MSF hospitals to give aid, until we stop ruining these areas for ourselves, we will never stop growing this. We will never stop growing this hostility. We will never stop giving rise to an ISIS and a Daesh and another and another and another thing after that. And so, yeah, I absolutely think Western intervention bred ISIS, has strengthened it, and will keep fanning that flame until it gets over its neocolonialistic ass. Okay, so yeah, I will be hopefully providing a summary of the debate so far, and I will try and be quick about it. So, yeah, I don't know, it's like something came up in Paul's speech about how, you know, Daesh are now asking for Russian assistance. And like, arguably that's merely a symptom of like Western intervention. If we see the West as, you know, what we consider like a liberal Western democracy, that's quite different to what we think of Russia as. And arguably, like it is the interaction of these Western liberal democracies in areas where they have no right to be apart from to serve their like own interests. That's led to these countries saying, okay, what is a separate, you know, relatively similarly advanced technological power we can turn to for assistance to grow our own ends? Yeah, Russia, like they're like asking for Russian assistance. No, thank you. Is more like a symptom of the fact that Western intervention has strengthened ISIS, has strengthened the beliefs that ISIS holds, than the fact that, you know, that it's not. Anyway, secondly, Paul talked a lot about how, you know, we were really complacent about what we'd done in that area. I think we need to stop talking about, you know, our complacence, and we need to start talking about how complicit we've been in, like, furthering this hostility, in, as I said, like, killing all these people whom you're, like, ingraining yourself with, you know, by giving them polio vaccines, etc., etc. We are no better than anyone else. We are no better than ISIS, who only lets in humanitarian aid, you know, in 1 out of 15 occasions to allow for polio vaccinations. Why? Because we did that in Afghanistan, because we did that in all the, you know, perpetrator states that have led to this hostility, that have led to, like, the building of ISIS. Okay, so, like, today in my course, I was learning about prodrugs. Prodrugs are a thing that lead to the activation of another drug. Like, if ISIS is, like, this drug that people think, you know, encapsulates all this feeling of hostility, all the feeling of Western hostility, we see in Western states when people ban the burqa, when people, you know, ban like communities' ability to express themselves, which leads to like ISIS being able to recruit these people from like different states, along with the discontent that's already being built in the Middle East. When you think that Daesh, like this really fatal, horrible like community that tramples everything that a peaceful religion stands for, when that's the drug, you can only say that like Western intervention, neocolonialist, like superciliousness is the prodrug to this, and that's like completely unacceptable. Yeah, that's actually like builds into Liam's argument mainly about like how we've like bred discontent in the region, and yeah, so well done. Yeah, fine, I'll take you.
So whatever about like attitudes towards people, historical colonialism, whatever, like recent airstrikes and assistance by the West, by the US, have pushed back Daesh, so fewer people are under their oppression, they have fewer resources. Why is that bad?
Because there were fewer people. Because like of the 19 incubators that were in that Médecins Sans Frontières hospital, 5 survived. 5 incubators for every person who is living there of a different faith, who is being persecuted by ISIS, of every person who is like there without a home, like for every single baby who was born premature or with like a congenital illness from all this tear gas ISIS is exposing to. 5 incubators are left for all the kids who are affected by ISIS because we have caused that. I still think that's a net harm. Anyway, I'm on 5 minutes and I have like 4 pages to get through. So anyway, Richard, so like, yeah, we all know that like Daesh is terrible. And like, you know, the Islamic world knows ISIS as Daesh, and I completely disagree with you, Miriam. I have to say, I will call them Daesh because I will defend the Muslim people's right to be identified as, you know, separate to this horrible, vile entity that is Daesh. And like, at the end of the day, so long as it's the West who've given them the money, the guns, and the megaphones in their hands to like self-style themselves as this Islamic caliphate no one wants to belong to, I think Western intervention is like completely to blame for their rise, and I think that's a deplorable thing. And like insofar as what you were saying, yeah, you know, we should have some kind of fragile peace. These people aren't piecemeal humans. They don't deserve piecemeal humanitarian aid that comes, you know, at the trade of, oh, but you have to risk your life for us, but you have to be collateral damage in this area. And so, no, I don't think it's at all valid for the West to now go and say, yeah, I want to intervene in this area, but I'll help you a bit, you know, so that I can keep furthering my interests here. No, thank you.
But so how do you help the people?
I'm sorry, you're not allowed to talk in between. Anyway, so yeah, I just like completely disagree with that. Also, I don't honestly have time to go into your speech, but like firstly, you said something about like, you know, oh yeah, Americans are going there and then helping the Iraqis like work for themselves. Yeah, rule by proxy, where did I see that? Oh yeah, when the British came to India and then caused the partition, yeah, rule by proxy did a fucking fabulous job. So like, you know, yeah, the Americans going in there was A-star content. Like, would definitely agree with.
That's not what I said, you're distorting.
Anyway, and yeah, also, secondly, just like, regardless of the whole of your speech, you just like insisting that Islamic State is a valid thing to call them. You insisting that, you know, it's a thing of Orientalism, which is also like an incredibly racist thing to say to people of the Middle East who do not appreciate being called that. It's this kind of colonialist worldview that I think we need to change coming to the end of my speech, because this has been an utter shambles. This kind of like colonialist view that we need to change, and, you know, the methods with which we intervene need to change, because otherwise intervention will have done nothing but like not only strengthen but validate everything ISIS stands for. Until we like stop trying to help just to conquer, and stop trying to shoot just to destroy the people who are collateral damage, and stop sticking our fingers in pies they don't belong in. Like, okay, don't fuck other cultures without their consent. Prevent the creation of another ISIS. Please propose.
Now we have Sam Brown to oppose.
His name isn't Phil, he's just in the film.
Sam Brown's constipated.
Yes. Give me a second. Ladies and gentlemen, when I first came to college in 2014, we were still having debates about ISIS and the Syrian civil war. Somehow we're still having them now. I'm sick of them. People were sick of them when I came to college, because this war has been tearing up that region since 2011. This conflict has gone on for an absurd length of time and caused an absurd amount of suffering. Hundreds of thousands of people are dead. Literally millions are displaced. Like, for the vast majority of that time, the West was sitting on its hands. In 2011, when Assad deployed chemical weapons, used sarin gas against his own people, causing them to choke to death in air, we did nothing. We set a red line and did not cross it. It took the Iraqi government to ask for intervention themselves, a democratically elected government in the region, to ask for Western intervention before anything happened. That's the first thing that we need to know. Now, of course, the Iraq War was certainly a partial cause. Like, so were the Crusades, so was the Sykes-Picot line in the first place. But in terms of other causes of this, we also have to look at Assad's response specifically after the Arab Spring and after waves of attempts to democratize that country. The case I want to make is that given the sheer amounts of human suffering happen, and given that I do think that we have some responsibility here, it is absurd and a ridiculous abdication of moral responsibility to simply do nothing. I think there's two things in this speech. Firstly, I want to talk about an empirical piece of thing, because I think that this motion in itself is not like exactly a normative moral question. There is an empirical sense in which ISIS has been weakened by Western intervention. Secondly, I'm going to make the moral case. Before that, a quick bit of rebuttal. Firstly, to what Liam said about how people, didn't care until ISIS started. I'll call them Daesh. Sorry. Until ISIS. That was the second thing I was going to say. Just got written down as ISIS everywhere. Until they started attacking us. Firstly, I think this is incredibly complicated, and there's like a spectrum of ways that people react to this. Certainly, that was the calculus for some Westerners, that it only matters when they start attacking us. But I don't don't think that's generally the case. I mean, the reason that the red line wasn't crossed was because of things like anxiety about the Iraq War. Specifically in Britain, it was voted down because Labour didn't support it, because Ed Miliband had significant anxieties and wanted to distance himself from Tony Blair and not make the same mistakes. Secondly, I don't think that it's true that the same regional concerns about things like oil are true, specifically because of fracking bringing the price of oil down to historic lows. It's the closest the US has ever come to invading itself for oil. They've been fairly successful in that respect. To what Al-Qadri said, yes, I'll call them ISIS, Daesh rather, just on the off chance that Abu Bakr is listening to the live stream. I'd like the idea of him just sitting in a bunker somewhere getting really annoyed. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the empirical component here. Look, like, the thing is, we can measure this. We can look at the amount of territory and people living under Daesh that there were in 2014 and after we started to intervene against them. They've lost 40% of their territory in Iraq. That is enormous and significant. Like, recently they lost Abq. No, thank you. That's incredibly, like, that's a city that was so important to them that they named their propaganda magazine after Abq, because they believed that that was going to be the place where the final battle between them and the infidel, as they conceive it, was going to happen, and when they would, finally establish the caliphate that would control the world. They've lost that. That's an enormous ideological blow. They're going to lose Mosul soon enough, one of the largest cities they've taken. This is specifically because of Western intervention asked for by Iraq. So Proposition can make this case that there is, like, there's going to be, like, some people coming and joining them. I mean, like, firstly, this should be intuitive, obviously. The West is significantly militarily powerful and can do these things. But propositions say things that, like, people are, like, going to join them. Like, firstly, I reject the idea, like, I don't think you can win the debate saying that it'll strengthen the idea of ISIS when it's actually literally weakening ISIS in a more literal and direct sense. But I think that, like, specifically, people aren't likely to join ISIS anymore, Daesh rather, sorry, I've got it written, because now they know what things are like, because more stories about what life is like there are getting out. But secondly, because their whole appeal is based on the fact that they are a local Leviathan state, that they are like a player that's actually powerful. If we make them literally weak, they are also ideologically weak, because so much of their narrative was based around the huge amounts of territories that they managed to take, no thank you, and the fact that the West wasn't able to take it back off them. Now, we should seriously consider the proposition that more people will be radicalized in general by this, but, like, the thing I want to say about this is that's not necessarily a reason prima facie of itself not to do anything about it. I think that some direct intervention has to be done. The main thing that you could do if you wanted to prevent radicalization is probably treat refugees fleeing that crisis like actual human beings. That's probably the major source of radicalization that happens. And of course, there's going to be, like interventions aren't ever good, but might be preferable than the outcome that we get otherwise. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why I think we should, and why there is a moral case to do this, and also how we should do this. No, thank you. So I would agree that, yes, the Iraq War, the invasion in 2003, was botched and was a significant factor in the development of the organization we've agreed to call Daesh in this debate. Firstly, the US destroyed the state as it existed there. I mean, of course, Saddam Hussein was awful and evil, but that creates an opportunity for an insurgent state, for an insurgent movement to arise. Secondly, it provided ample grievance. To be clear, what happened in Fallujah was a war crime. The use of near-nuclear-grade weapons on civilian populations is a war crime. What happened at Abu Ghraib was a crime against humanity. What they're still doing in Guantanamo Bay is also a crime against humanity. That is ample grievance. So I take Dr. Al-Qadri's point. I believe, for a start, that Western intervention may have created Daesh, but this is a problem of definitions and how you consider this debate. I'm not going to talk about, like, all the general intervention. I'm talking about specifically what we've been doing since 2014. I believe it's morally justifiable, and I believe specifically that it has weakened Daesh, sorry. But the point is, right? This is largely something that we have contributed creating through generations of war crimes going back all the way to the First Crusade. Since 1096, we've been messing this up. For nearly 1,000 years, we've been messing this up. And like, when a democratic elected government comes to us and asks us for help because they think we're our only chance, I think that it's ridiculous not to intervene. I think, like, firstly, the next thing to acknowledge is that if we don't intervene, that doesn't mean that there is no intervention, because Russian intervention on Assad's side is simply a fact of life in this debate. And it is true what Al-Qadri said, like, peace was ensured under Assad for a while, but peace can never return to Syria as long as Assad remains. Like, his use of barrel bombs and sarin gas against civilian populations is, like, a ridiculous thing to allow him to stay in power after that. And moreover, he's killed more people than Daesh have killed in the region. It's ridiculous, and, like, refugees who would like to see their home again before they die can never do so as long as Assad remains president. I simply don't think it's an option to leave him in power in the region. And the only way to ensure that is to make sure that Russia aren't the only institution, the only foreign power that are active in the region, and there needs to be some sort of counterbalance. They're mainly intervening in Syria. Our intervention in Iraq can be the effective counterbalance to that. In terms of how we do this, this obviously cannot be a repeat of Iraq. This has to be like internationally cooperative. It has to be done through international organizations and by people probably more qualified than me to talk about it. But something has to be done, and we certainly can do it. Don't oppose this motion out of moral discomfort. Don't oppose this motion because Western intervention has gone badly before. If Western intervention has ever been justified since World War II, it is now. Please oppose.